Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We're very excited to have everyone join us. We have a pretty large crowd today, so as people continue to pop on in, I'll go ahead and make some introductions. This webinar today is going to be around understanding corrective actions, nonconformities, and root cause analysis. We're very excited to have Heather McLemore with A2LA on the call today to really dive into some of these details. A couple of housekeeping items to go through before we get started. Number one, and it's usually the most popular question we always get asked, is this going to be recorded? Absolutely. We're recording it now. And so as soon as that recording has been loaded and is up and available, we'll go ahead and share that with everybody. So you have a copy of that. So if you ever want to watch it again or share it with others, you have that ability. Also, we're going to be doing a question and answer session towards the end of the presentation. So if you have questions and you want to ask them, please feel free to put those in the Q&A section of the Zoom webinar. We'll go through those at the end, whether they're for Heather with A2LA or for us at Qualtrics. We'll make sure to get all of those questions answered for you. So because we have a nice mix of people on this webinar today, and I love looking through the attendee list because I see names that are familiar that have attended multiple webinars that we've done, and then of course names that I've never seen before. So if you're new to our webinars, definitely welcome. And if you aren't new and you've come to a couple of them, welcome back. To give you some background about who Qualtrics is and why we do these webinars, Qualtrics is an all-in-one compliance management solution. We've actually been around for about 28 years. We started our software and our company because 28 years ago, our parent company also had to be under ISO compliance. They started going through the process and quickly realized that they needed a better way to manage all of the details. They started building a system to help manage that. That was Qualtrics. So over the last 28 years, the system has really grown. And now we are a leading quality management system in many different industries, including laboratories for 17025. And we're happy to count many of the accrediting bodies as customers, including A2LA, who's going to be presenting with us today. So let's get down to it. I want to introduce you to Heather McLemore. She's actually been with A2LA since 2019. She's an accreditation officer that oversees the AOAC accreditation program. And in January 2020, she became a staff-approved lead assessor and has performed more than a dozen quality management system assessments. Prior to that, she has over 8 years of food microbiology experience, having worked in both beef slaughter and further processed meat facilities. This experience has allowed Heather to generate customer confidence with her knowledge of ISO, IEC 17025 requirements, as well as understand the language used in tests performed by the labs she is responsible for throughout the entire accreditation process. So with that being said, Heather, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to invite you to take control and share yours.
Great, thanks, Karen. Give me 1
Absolutely.
second here. All right, everybody see that okay?
It's coming, it's coming. Here it is. I see it now, Heather.
Wonderful. Okay, great. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Karen said, my name is Heather McLemore. I'm an accreditation officer too with A2LA, and I also had the AOAC accreditation program. Today, I'll be speaking on understanding non-conforming work, corrective actions, and root cause analysis. Oh gosh, sorry. This is why we do this stuff ahead of time. So just a brief overview of what I'll be covering today. First, we'll start with an introduction of A2LA and the ISO IEC 17025 standard. Then I will define and give examples on non-conforming work and corrective actions. A root cause analysis is required for a corrective action response, so I'll offer a few ways to perform that. And then finally, I will touch on risks and opportunities as they relate to nonconformities and corrective actions. So who is A2LA? A2LA is the only independent nonprofit accrediting body in the United States. We offer accreditation to 7 different ISO standards, as you can read there in the slide, as well as optional accreditation schemes such as the 2018 AOAC guidelines, the TNI environmental guidelines, things like that. We've been around for over 40 years, and the first organization that we ever accredited is still with us today. We are committed to a culture of quality, integrity, community, accountability, and leadership with a vision of accreditation accepted everywhere. So now that you know a little bit more about A2LA, let's talk a bit about the standard I'm going to be discussing, ISO IEC 17025. These are the general requirements for the competence of testing and calibration laboratories. This standard was established in the mid-1970s by experts in laboratory assessment. They wanted to differentiate between technical competence of labs from just compliance to specific requirements. Since its inception, the ISO 17025 standard has been used to establish a global baseline for accreditation. A2LA has performed over 2,700 assessments to this standard, both on-site and most recently due to the pandemic, we have performed over hundreds of these assessments remotely as well. The ISO IEC 17025 standard is organized into 8 sections, as you can see here. Sections 1 through 3 are informational only for those seeking accreditation or those labs who are already accredited. The assessments are performed against the clauses in sections 4 through 8. So today I'll be focusing on section 7.10, nonconforming work, and section 8.7, corrective actions. So regarding nonconforming work, the standard actually states the laboratory shall have a procedure that shall be implemented when any aspect of its laboratory activities or results of this work do not conform to its own procedures or the agreed requirements of the customer. So some examples of non-conforming work against the lab's own procedures could be, maybe an incubator temperature was too high or a pipetter wasn't calibrated on time. For something going against customer agreements, it could be maybe the results were sent via email when they should have been faxed or called in. Anything that goes wrong in the lab is considered a non-conformance first and foremost. You do need to have a procedure for non-conforming work, and the standard lists out what those requirements, the requirements that are supposed to be in that procedure. So first off, we need to have the responsibilities and the authorizations for the management of non-conforming work. Those need to be clearly defined. Any actions that you take need to be based on risk levels that your organization establishes. I'll touch on that a little bit later in the presentation. Just know that these actions can include things such as halting or repeating work or delaying the reporting of results. You'll then need to evaluate the significance of the non-conforming work, including potential impact on previous results if it relates to the result, if it relates to customer results. And then once the evaluation is made, then you need to determine the acceptability of the non-conformance. Your procedure also needs to include instances where it may be necessary to notify the customer or even initiate a recall. It's not going to be in every circumstance, so your procedure needs to define that. And then finally, you need to define who is responsible for authorizing the resumption of work. If there is any chance that the non-conforming work could recur, corrective action shall be implemented. So corrective actions, these are always in response to non-conformances. The lab needs to take action to control and correct the non-conformance and then also address the consequences, which includes an evaluation. What actions do you need to take to eliminate the cause or causes in order to prevent or minimize this nonconformity from recurring? So this evaluation begins with reviewing and analyzing the nonconformity, determining the cause, and then determining if similar nonconformances exist or could potentially occur. So you see that I've highlighted determine cause in there. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to dive a little deeper into what that means. So when we discuss determining the cause of a nonconformance, we're often talking about getting to the root cause or the main reason a problem or nonconformance occurred. As you perform this root cause analysis, you may find there is more than one root cause, which is completely fine. Oftentimes there is more than just one reason why something happened. But the purpose is to solve the problem to minimize the chance of recurrence. So addressing that obvious solution isn't always enough. And a root cause analysis must be performed as an investigation. It's not a blame game. You're not trying to blame somebody or get somebody in trouble. You're also not looking for a quick fix. You need to do a little bit of digging and you need to put some work into determining a root cause. It's also helpful to establish the sequence of events that led to the nonconformance, as that helps give a better understanding of the relationship between contributory factors. So how do you perform a root cause analysis? You start by defining the problem, which we've already done. There's a nonconformance. Then you need to gather data and evidence, and this can be in the form of records, documents, interviewing personnel, using flowcharts or diagrams, creating a checklist. Once you have all of that information, then you can identify the cause or causes of the nonconformance and then choose the appropriate corrective actions to prevent recurrence. In the next few slides, I'm going to show some different ways to perform a root cause analysis. Please know no one method is the most correct. You'll actually need to figure out what works best for your situation and your organization. And it might be that one or two work better instead of just one. So the first one we're going to start with is called the Fivewise. This approach traces the chain of events that led to the problem, starting with the nonconformance and working your way backwards. This is one of the easiest ways to perform a root cause analysis, but it can be restrictive as it inherently assumes there's only one why. So on this slide, we have an example. There is a puddle of water on the floor. Well, so then we start asking our whys. Well, why is there a puddle of water on the floor? Well, we look up and we're like, oh, hey, the pipe overhead is leaking. All right, so great. So you fix the pipe. Well, that's good. That's a good and immediate fix. But is that really the reason why there's water on the floor? Why is the pipe leaking? Well, you go and do a little bit of digging and you find out there's too much water pressure in the pipe. Okay, so why is there too much water pressure in the pipe? Well, you do a little bit more digging, you ask around, you look around, and you find out that there's a faulty control valve. Okay, that's interesting. That's not supposed to happen. Why is there a faulty control valve? And you do some more digging around and maybe talking to people, looking at records, maintenance logs, and things. Oh, the control valves haven't been tested. Well, that's interesting. Those need to be tested. I wonder why they haven't been. And you finally get down to the control valves aren't on the maintenance schedule. So if you work your way back from the root cause, so you're going to put that on, that's going to be your root cause. The control valves weren't on the maintenance schedule. Your corrective action, we're going to put control valves on the maintenance schedule, which will then hopefully prevent the puddle of water being on the floor due to all of these possible causes. So you see how we went from here's a problem, here's the quick, easy fix, all the way down to, all right, there's the quick, easy fix, but this is the main reason why this happened. Another way to perform a root cause analysis is to look at cause and effect, as seen as what we call a fishbone diagram. We already know the effect or the problem, it's the nonconformance. So this is just kind of a visual way to determine the cause or causes. This type of root cause analysis is especially helpful in brainstorming sessions. This diagram has 6 categories. You may not need to use all 6, or you can make up your own. There might not be a cause identified for every category. The purpose here is just to gather facts and complete the diagram. So defining the categories, at the top we've got materials, and those could be raw material, consumables, information is a material. Methods, your procedures, you want to look at your work instructions, amendments to procedures. You want to look at your machines. Are they defective? Were they not maintained, not calibrated? Did they overload? For your measurements, were the proper calibrations done? Were the appropriate calibrations taken? In your environment, how was the temperature, the humidity, your work area? Were there any distractions around? People get really distracted by things sometimes, and that could cause issues to happen. And then your people, is there a lack of training? Was there some verbal miscommunication or a lack of communication? Does your organization have a high turnover? When you take all of these into account, then we can create our fishbone diagram. And here we have a batch of bad burgers. So you can see the 6 different categories branching off the backbone, and there's smaller bones identifying possible causes. Maybe the storage and cooking equipment had poor maintenance. Maybe there was mishandling by the personnel. They didn't have sufficient training. Maybe it was, the environment was too hot. Maybe, we didn't put in the right amount of spices. These are all things that contribute, that could be potential causes to why you had a bad burger. This fishbone diagram is great because it allows you to identify all the possible causes of a nonconformance, but it doesn't point to a well-defined root cause. It's up to your team to identify the most likely root cause or causes, and the one that you choose may or may not be the correct one. The last example I'm going to show is called a fault tree analysis. It combines the best of the 5 whys and the fishbone diagram, as it's a visual depiction that allows you to look deeper into the causal factors of a problem. It can help you prioritize action items and can offer both qualitative and quantitative analysis if that's something your organization has. A fault tree analysis is often used to prevent issues before they happen, but it can be useful to employ after an issue is found. So in this example, at the top, you see the nonconformance, an employee fell. Not only did the employee fall, but we have more, we did that investigative digging. This employee fell on this date at this time in this location. Then you go into your investigative, that first branch down. Well, the floor was wet. I didn't see a sign, but I was wearing my shoe covers in the area. All right, so those are all great things. All right, so now that we know all those things, we dig a little bit deeper. Okay, well, the floor was wet at the time. Well, why was the floor wet? Well, the sanitation people come in and they mop the floor every day at 4 o'clock. And we see in the nonconformance at the top, this spill happened at 4:05, and the mopping procedure requires 10-minute contact time. Okay, well, now we might have something here, right? This table, I will say, is not complete, but it's just kind of an overall idea of how this looks. So what you're going to do is you're going to keep creating lines and branches until you get to the root cause of that branch. And then from there, you will choose the best root cause that you believe caused the problem. So now that we've seen a few different ways to conduct a root cause analysis, we're going to go back to corrective actions. Just to recap, corrective actions are always in response to nonconformities. A corrective action needs to control and correct the issue as well as address the consequences, and there needs to be an evaluation. So after you've determined the cause, then you need to decide on a course of action and implement it. The action you choose needs to be appropriate to address the root cause, and you might find that more than one action is needed. So going back to the nonconformance all the way at the beginning, we had an incubator temp that was too high. Maybe the root cause analysis showed that the thermometer hadn't been calibrated in 2 years. One possible action would be to fire the employee responsible for sending thermometers out for calibrations, but is that appropriate to the root cause? Probably not. So you instead decide to send the thermometer out for calibration, which is your quick fix, but then you need to update your calibration schedule and train your employees. That seems a bit more appropriate to that scenario. Once you've implemented that action, then you have to review if it was effective or not. If the corrective action doesn't appear to be effective, you may need to try a different corrective action or even revisit the root cause analysis stage. The standard doesn't specify a time frame for reviewing effectiveness, but you'll definitely want to stay on top of things. Some corrective actions might take a little longer to implement than others, especially if you're creating a whole new program, or if your calibration program is every year. Obviously, you can't find out in 6 months if that's been effective or not. And then finally, some things that you might have to do for corrective actions but aren't always required. You might have to update your risks and opportunities or make changes to the management system. So in risks and opportunities. So with the implementation of the 2017 standard, labs were required to take a risk-based approach to their operations. This allows labs to have more flexibility in their management system while still adhering to the stringent requirements for competence. Different labs face different issues, but all labs have risks. The standard does give some notes when determining what might constitute a risk to your organization. Your lab might identify threats that you want to avoid, or maybe you want to take a risk to pursue an opportunity. Maybe you need to eliminate a source of risk. Maybe as you consider changing, consider the likelihood of a risk occurring and the possible changes and consequences if that risk becomes a reality. Maybe you want to share risk with another organization, like, hey, we want to do this thing, but we can't do it alone. So we're gonna share this with somebody else. You could also decide that the benefits the benefits outweigh the risk, and so you decide to take a risk based on an informed decision. The risks your lab faces open the door to opportunities that you might not have previously considered. So some of these could include expanding the scope of your lab activities, opportunities to address or reach new customers, an opportunity to acquire new technology, or learn other ways to address your customers' needs. So remember in the beginning, we talked about the actions taken on non-conforming work need to be based on risk levels established by your lab. Well, how do you establish those risk levels? The easiest way to do it is a risk table, as you can see here. First, you need to determine what risks your lab faces, which we just talked about a moment ago. different types of risks. So this can be done by a brainstorming session using a cross section of people associated with your organization. You can perform a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. I'm not going to delve into that here. We're just going to focus on this risk table. So if you see along the y-axis, you have the probability of an event occurring. And then the y-axis shows the potential impact, the sensitivity or the value of the data or the damage that risk could cause. So measuring the probability versus the impact can actually help give weight to the possible risks. You can use a table like the one shown here. You can use a spreadsheet, whatever your lab decides to track that stuff. If you use a table or a spreadsheet, you can assign a value to probabilities and impacts. For example, 1 is a low probability, low impact, and 5 is a high probability, a high impact. Then you can multiply those numbers together to determine the risk an event could cause. So using this 1 to 5 scale, the highest possible risk is a score of 25. And it's up to your lab to set the threshold limits for those calculated weights. What constitutes a medium risk? What constitutes a low risk? When are we going to say that this risk requires our non-conforming work turning into a corrective action? That is something that only you can define. It is worth noting that the ISO IEC 17025 standard does not require you to have a written procedure or even maintain a record when considering risks and opportunities, though it is required to be addressed in your management review. I realized that I did very, very fast on this. So I'm getting ready to wrap things up here. So to wrap things up, non-conforming work doesn't always require corrective action. It is seen more as a correction or a quick fix. It does require a written procedure, and that written procedure needs to include responsibilities and authorities for halting and resuming work, taking actions and evaluating the nonconformance, and taking a decision on the acceptability of the nonconforming work. Whether a nonconformance requires a corrective action is based on the risk levels established by your laboratory. Corrective actions are always in response to a nonconformance. A written procedure is not required, but you do need to perform a cause analysis. And the most popular ones, again, the Fivewise, the fishbone, or the fault tree analysis. And you may need to update your risks and opportunities depending on the outcome of your corrective actions. One thing that both non-conforming work and corrective actions require is that you keep records that you implemented these procedures. Remember, if you can't prove that your lab did something that you said you would do, it's as though you never did it. And with that, I want to thank you all for your time, and I'm going to turn it over to Karen now.
Heather, thank you so very much. I mean, and I'm going to kind of talk about like when we met last week to review this presentation. I think when you start diving into some of this information, and it just becomes apparent how important it is to keep some of these records. Out of curiosity, what is, in your opinion, in your experience as an assessor, but then even in the laboratory itself, what do you believe people miss the most, or organizations miss the most, when trying to make sure that they're going through nonconformances and corrective actions?
It's not so much what organizations miss, it's what they do. A lot of organizations, I believe, try to do too much. They'll get a nonconformance and they will, let's say the nonconformance, again, I really like this. I like this incubator temperature thing. So let's say, this incubator, the temperature was out of spec, and it was out of spec for 3 days. So they will do training. They will, so their corrective action will be, they'll have that problem. They will say in their, the root cause analysis was the person wasn't properly trained, and then, but then they'll go further. They'll be like, okay, this person wasn't properly trained, but then we need to update our SOP to make sure that this person was trained. Oh, and then we need to make sure everybody gets trained on this. And oh, we need to create a new checklist for this because this didn't work the right way. So if the root cause was the person wasn't properly trained, that's all labs really need to focus on. It's like, all right, we need to train that person. If you try to do too many corrective actions at once, again, how I ended that presentation, if you can't prove that you did something, or if you say you're going to do something, you have to prove that you did it. So a lot of labs point themselves into a corner where they say they're going to do all these grand things, And then it turns out that it really wasn't necessary to do all of those things. They really just had to make one or two changes. Again, you can always go back and
Mm,
revisit a cause. You know, if you're reviewing the effectiveness, if you realize that, hey, this didn't work out the way we thought it would, you can always go back and revisit that root cause. You don't have to make all the changes at once. Focus on one, maybe two, and focus on the main ones, and then go back if it turns out that it's not working.
fantastic. No, that's really good insight, right? Because I feel like the gut is, okay, do everything you possibly can to correct, but I can definitely see the point where it's like you want to keep this simple, right? We all think of KISS, keep it simple, stupid, when you
Yes.
start thinking about things, and it's like only address what you need to, because like you said, I mean, the record keeping behind it all can be where, we typically hear laboratories, and not just laboratories, but organizations under 9001, CLIA cap, they can get, they can keep it, they can get pretty overwhelmed that way. So, well, and really that's a great way to segue into why Qualtrics exists and kind of what we're doing, and what we see organizations are, why they're thinking and considering using electronic quality management systems. Um, let's see, I am going to pull up my demo. And what I'm going to do now, the way that we do these webinars, we always kind of take a presentation and a topic that's very, top of mind, especially around nonconformances, corrective actions, risk, identifying opportunities for improvement, all of these processes that you're doing within IEC 17 or ISO IEC 17025. And then it's like, okay, well, what can we do in the laboratory to automate some of this to make sure that we're capturing all those records? The thing that popped out, very big on your screen, Heather, was that word of make sure that you have records, is that phrase, because at the end of the day, from what we hear from our accrediting body partners, is that that's where, if you can't prove that you have the records and you're capturing that, and like to your point, showing and proving that you said that you were going to do what you said you were going to do, that's where you can get into trouble. So what I'm going to show you is exactly how you're capturing some of that information in quality management systems like Qualtrics. For those of you who have never seen Qualtrics, what we're an all-in-one compliance management solution that organizations use to manage a lot of their quality initiatives. So think about document management and testing and training of competency for employees. But we also have a portion of our product that is around process automation. So when you're thinking about using technology, like Qualtrics, there's other ones out there as well. Process automation is really an area where you can get more efficiencies around your quality system. Now, what type of process automation are we looking for, especially when you're thinking about a QMS? There are core quality management 17025 processes that can benefit from process automation. So when you're thinking about what you want to do, and what you want to bring in, looking for systems that do nonconformance tracking, corrective action tracking, even things like management review are often things that you want to see in a system to make sure that you're automating as much as you possibly can. We refer to this automation as workflows. So workflows for us are ways to automate different processes where different steps of the processes are defined and notifications are being sent between those steps to make sure that people are being held accountable for what they need to complete, and that at the end of the day, quality team members and lab directors have the information and proof that the processes are being followed. We often get asked questions like, well, how does Qualtrics align with 17025? Well, what we've done is actually take some of the core processes around 17025 and build them into a Qualtrics. We call these our best-in-class workflows. And so you'll see some that Heather just pointed out: nonconformance tracking and reporting, corrective action tracking, audit management, customer feedback. And so when you are listening to Heather's presentation and she's talking about nonconforming events and where they're coming from, some of these actually will come from different processes like this. Like, how are you capturing your customer feedback? Feedback comes in and there's something that's not right. That might be a nonconformance that needs to go to a corrective action. So having that ability to have all of these in one system can be very helpful for organizations. Let's go ahead and kick one of these off, and we'll go through what these processes look like. And I want to bring your attention to this flow diagram down here at the bottom. What you see here is we've taken just a simple process like non-conforming events, just tracking them and making sure that people are aware of what's happening in the organization. And we divided that process into some key steps. So gathering the details, reviewing if a nonconformance and a corrective action is necessary or not, and then launching a corrective action workflow. So from here, the first step is going to be give a description of the observed issue. So in this case, let's pretend that the laboratory accidentally sent a document to a wrong customer for some reason. So the lab report was sent to the wrong lab. We know that this came in through a customer complaint. Maybe the customer reached back and said this was not the right report that was supposed to come to us. This was somebody else's lab or organization's report. That information came in through customer feedback. We can actually log that the source was customer feedback here. Now, the nice thing about this is anybody in the organization can submit these types of processes, because when you think about it, anybody in your laboratory is going to be able to get and observe a nonconformance and be able to report it to quality. Well, instead of going to quality, and maybe that's the lab director or the quality manager or whoever's running quality for the organization, instead of them taking action, they can just simply come into a system and type in the details. We're going to submit this. What's going to happen is now quality is now being notified that they have a workflow that they need to take action on. This was the information that was submitted, and then they're going to continue on with some of the details. So maybe this came through an email from customer, and we want to talk through the customer name and who's going to be notified. It's asking me if work stopped. In this case, work did not stop, but there's sometimes could be instances where it did, like if a piece of equipment wasn't properly calibrated in the time frame that it needed to be or something. And so this is where you would log that. And then when the work stopped and when did it resume. The next area is going to be where we start talking about some of those corrective action details and nonconformances. So Qualtrics, the big thing with our process automation is we're guiding people through those processes to make sure that they can't deviate. So even from this step, we can start seeing that we are showing people root cause analysis, and we're choosing who's going to be responsible for this. I'm Corey, who happens to be a quality manager, so I'm going to continue to stay as Corey. And so Corey is going to get notified when root cause is necessary. I can type in when this occurred, choose what section or department it occurred in. I also have the ability to link to standards. You know, where we happen to be talking about 17025 2017 today, but at the end of the day, Qualtrics and other systems out there can be used for multiple different types of compliance that you may be under. The nice thing about having the standards and the clauses associated with this is that you can actually see trends in your reporting to understand, you know, do you have risks and opportunities for improvement around specific standards in your organization and clauses? What was the description of the observed issue? So in this case, wrong report was sent. Was there any immediate action taken? Maybe we immediately sent the new report to the right customer. Is there any supporting documentation to add here, like maybe the email that came in with the complaint? And at this point, you'll notice that the next step is actually launching a corrective action workflow. You know, because nonconformances can be identified in a number of different areas that we're tracking in Qualtrics, launching a corrective action workflow is something that you'll see coming off of a lot of our workflows. So this happens to be nonconformances. You can do it with customer feedback, audits, management review, and so on. So if I hit review complete, you'll notice that that workflow went away, right? Because now we're about to start working within a corrective action request. What's happening and what you can't see is my system is actually spinning up a corrective action request. We are going to be sending that to the appropriate team to take action. So in this case, here's the corrective action request. I've got all of the information that was submitted during my nonconformance report. It was just copied and pasted directly into this corrective action request. And now the system is going to take me through the corrective action process. That first step being root cause. And so going through root cause, trying to really identify, like Heather was saying, what was the cause of the problem? What do we actually need to fix here? What do we need to make adjustments to, right? How do we take these opportunities and better put different practices and processes in place for our organization? So we can see here, we've got the information that was originally submitted, and then the system's going to take me through different options. I can see I'm Corey, I'm going to be doing root cause analysis. So I can go through this. So maybe in this case, we realize that we have two customers and the same first name and last name, an individual, or not individual, but two people have the same names at each of those locations. Well, maybe that's the reason why. Maybe we need to find a better way to manage our records to make sure that we can clearly identify them in the future. And so that's where we're going to be really diving into that root cause analysis and trying to come up with a solution. Who's going to be responsible for corrective action plan? Maybe it's Corey again, or maybe I want to send this to my laboratory directors. We'll keep it with Corey so it stays with me. But what you see here is that you have the ability to choose individuals or groups depending on what step of the process you're in, so they can start being brought into this process to take responsibility and being held accountable. Here's all the details around my nonconformances or my nonconformance, and now it's having me go through my corrective action plan. What are we going to change? What needs to be adjusted in the system to make sure that we avoid this in the future? And so we won't go through the whole entire process, but you can kind of get an idea of what's happening. We are guiding organizations through these different steps to make sure that they can prove that they have the records, that their laboratory has met all the requirements for corrective actions and nonconformance tracking. So it'll go through plan development. It could go back and forth between parties until it's finalized. That plan will be implemented, and then eventually effectiveness review will happen. At effectiveness review, this is usually something that happens in the future and can often be missed because it's something that's not top of mind. Well, with Qualtrics, we're setting a date for effectiveness review. So in the event that somebody doesn't go through it, the system will make sure that they're sending reminders around this to make sure people are getting it done at the timely manner. The system will guide you through contacting customers and such, and then eventually this information will be closed. Why does this type of automation exist, and why is it beneficial to organizations? Because it's going to make sure that, number one, you can't deviate from these processes. Even if you have a paper form or an electronic Excel document that's currently doing this now, there's still the possibility that somebody might deviate from that process. Something might get lost. Something might get lost in email and so on. Or somebody might forget to do something. Well, that's unfortunately something that can hurt an organization when they're getting audited. With Qualtrics, because everything is in the system like this, you can't deviate from those processes. So a question that we'll always get is like, okay, well then what does this look like when you're trying to report on it? How do you get access to these records? So if I click reports, and we're going to leave this corrective action, I can actually run a report of all of my corrective actions that have been submitted in the system. I can always filter based on what step they're in or what department they were associated with, or even what standard and clause they related to if I really wanted to. And here's a list now in a report of all the corrective actions that have been submitted in this system. I can see the original source, the description, the occurrence, the corrective action plan, the root cause analysis, and so on. And so when Heather starts talking about management review and trying to find those risks and opportunities for improvement, these are the reports our customers today are reviewing to be able to try to find some of those trends and opportunities for improvement. Because think about it from a standard point. Standpoint. So like if you've got the clauses associated with your corrective actions linked in here, and you start seeing that you have a lot around equipment maintenance or nonconformance tracking, and those numbers and those clauses keep popping up, well, guess what? That's a great way to be able to visualize that you need to maybe put in some adjustments to some of those plans out of the data that you're collecting in systems like Qualtrics. And so it really can be helpful. That's the type of data that you would then take back to your management review records and type in and say, yes, these were risks for our organization. We want to make sure that we're capturing that and putting action plans around that to make sure that these risks are being monitored or handled. We do have a risk assessment workflow. It's a part of our best in class. It's a risk assessment that allows you to grade your different risks. And so when Heather went through the medium and the highs and the lows in that matrix, a lot of our organizations are using that today to really manage those records to prove compliance and that they're tracking their risks. Now, one of the things that we didn't talk about that Heather spent a lot of time talking about is the different ways of doing root cause analysis. So the 5 why process, the fishbone, and even the fault tree analysis, which was actually new to me. I was learning about that one last week when Heather and I were going through this presentation. One of the things that's really nice about some quality management systems, Qualtrics included, is the ability to configure these processes. So like we'll have organizations that really have been doing corrective action tracking and nonconformance tracking, many years prior to using systems like ours. We never want to force you to comply with a specific way of doing something. We always want to give you the flexibility to take our system and make it your own. And so we give you the ability to adjust Qualtrics to do so. With that being said, we have organizations, like we'll say when we come down to this corrective action request, that will actually build out the 5 why process or the fishbone approach within the workflow itself. They do that by creating a series of different text fields and select lists, really forcing their employees to go through the appropriate format that their organization has determined is going to be best for their needs. I always mention that because one of the things that we always get asked about is like, well, what's the glass ceiling with your system? If we purchase it today, is it going to meet our needs in 5 years or 10 years or even 20 years like some of our customers? And the answer is, we know that your organization is changing all the time. We want to make sure that you have a system that changes with you. So that flexibility that you have in our system is definitely going to be helpful for that. Now, as I wrap up, and I know that we've got a lot of questions coming in, so we'll start addressing those here shortly. The last thing I'll say is that workflow functionality is just one aspect of Qualtrics. There's a lot more that you will see in our system as well. On top of other quality management systems that are on the market today, there's a lot of them out there if that's something that you're looking into bringing in for automation. So having a quality management system that also offers document management is something that's very helpful, making sure all of your documents are one location, always up to date. Testing and training. So when Heather talked about organizations will train or retrain people on those SOPs if there was a nonconformance. That's stuff that can happen in our system and have it automatically tracked as well. And so all of that needs to be tracked. That is why Qualtrics exists and all their quality management systems out there to make sure that you can prove that you are capturing that information for your organization when you're going through that audit. All right. Well, that brings me to the end of the Qualtrics portion. I see that we have a lot of questions that are coming in, so let's just go ahead and dig into those. And Heather, if you want to join me, we can just start going through those, and we'll kind of take it from there.
Great.
All right. So let me see. We did have a question that came in pretty early on that you might be able to go through. This was a question that says this person was looking to, let me get that right in front of me so I'd make sure I read this correctly. That this person is interested in seeing how other labs are doing their evaluation of significance or their risk matrix. Do you have any insight about what some of the labs are doing for their risk matrix and risk assessments?
Yeah, so I as an assessor, as an employee of A2LA, I obviously can't sit there and say this is the way you should do it. But I have that risk table that I showed in the presentation. The low, medium, high. That's one that's very, very popular. Giving weight to that risk. I mean, you could just do a low, medium, high. Like this is a low risk to our organization. This is a high risk to our organization. You can give weight to that risk. I've seen labs do the probability times impact, and they get a number off of that, and then that determines whether or not that's a risk that their lab's willing to take. It could just be just sitting down and typing out in a Word document. Is this a risk? Nope. Is this a risk? Nope. Is this a risk? Yep.
Hmm.
So there's many different ways to do it. I would say that the risk table is probably the most common that I see, but it's obviously not the only one out there. The SWOT analysis is also really popular. It's the 4 boxes: your strengths and your weaknesses, your threats and your opportunities. And then from there, you look at your strengths. Obviously, maybe there's some risk in your strengths. Maybe there's some, there should be some risks in your weaknesses. There might be some risks in some of the threats to your business. There might be some risk in the opportunities to your business. So that's another thing that I've seen, both as an assessor and accreditation officer.
Great. No, that's very helpful. And I'll just point this out too, to kind of piggyback what she's saying. And because we've seen that as well. We've got some organizations that will create their own risk assessment processes and such like that and do the matrices. We've also seen some organizations use our risk assessment workflow because it allows you to kind of grade those risks. So like if I put in some information here, and let me just type in the owner so we can go to the next step, you'll actually see, so when Heather talks about grading them and choosing how your grade is, you get to choose, okay, well, what type of risk is this? What's the overall risk status? Is it acceptable under review or so on? And then you've got the risk analysis. And so for each individual risk, you're determining, okay, is it medium, low, moderate to extreme, likelihood of occurrence, ability to mitigate, risk level, red, yellow, green, and so on. And so through some of that, even you're able to really make sure that you are grading those risks appropriately to make sure that your organization knows what needs to be monitored or handled today versus something that just needs to be monitored over time. Hopefully that was helpful, Deborah. There was another one that came in through the chat from Mohammed, and this says, in the case of the 5 why root cause analysis, how many whys are acceptable in cause analysis if someone doesn't want to go all the way through the 5 whys?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So they call it the 5 whys. I'm not exactly sure where that number 5 came from. Probably because, if you remember from my example, there's a puddle of water on the floor, the overhead pipe is leaking, there's too much pressure in the water pipe. So you could stop there. You could stop there and say, oh, hey, there's too much water pressure in the pipe. We're going to turn that, we're just going to turn the water pressure down. But you have to think, is that actually going to solve the problem? It might solve it, for the next month. It might solve it for the next year, but it's not going to solve the problem in the long term. So you really have to dig deeper. Like, okay, so why is there too much pressure in the water pipe? Oh, and then you dig deeper and you're like, we've got a faulty control valve. The control valve hasn't been tested. That's because they're not on the maintenance schedule. So no, you don't have to do, you don't have to ask why 5 times. You don't have to do the 5 whys. You can stop at 2 or 3. You might find that there might only be 2 or 3 whys why something happened. But if you start, digging a little bit more, that's why I said this is going to take a little bit of work, because like the obvious solution isn't, 99% of the time, the most obvious solution is not the actual main reason something happened. So digging a little bit deeper, it's going to take a little bit more time, but then you can be confident that you have looked at all the possible causes, you've done your due diligence. This is, all right, we're going to put these control valves on the maintenance schedule. This is going to prevent this from happening in the future. It might not prevent it, things happen, things break, but the likelihood of it happening has been decreased exponentially than if you just said, oh, we're just going to turn down the water pressure in the pipe.
Oh, great. There was a question that came in, are the corrective actions and nonconformance workflows available? It would be good for, it would be a good start for our lab. Absolutely. So if you're in fact, we actually work with a lot of startup laboratories, as well as laboratories who have been 17025 for years that have gotten to a point where it's just becoming too much and they need to convert to a system. Absolutely. I think the nice thing that we see with startup laboratories is that they're starting to bring in systems like Qualtrics early into that process because they can identify, especially if they've gone through 17025 before and they have that experience, they know the amount of manual work that's involved with it. So they identify that extremely early on when they're starting the laboratory. Will buy the system, sometimes even before they're buying LIMS systems, to start building out their SOPs and their processes. And what they'll do with our best-in-class workflows is actually use those out of the box, so they don't have to recreate their own process and then adapt them to Qualtrics. They'll just use the Qualtrics best-in-class workflows of how they're done. And I'll give you a little tip. Those best-in-class workflows that we created, we didn't just randomly decide to create them and put them out there. We actually worked a lot with the accrediting bodies and our customer base to kind of get an idea of what the basics that we needed to meet 17025 requirements. So there was a lot of research that was done to really make sure that those were up to par with what you needed for 17025. If you are a startup laboratory, definitely let us know if you're interested in systems like this, because we actually have a program with A2LA workplace training for startup laboratories to give you some content with our system as well. So definitely something to. Heather, this one's for you. Can you address the difference between a variance and a non-conforming work?
I think I need a little bit more background on what they mean by variance, because in my head that is, I mean, I think of a variance as something that's just a little bit different. So I'm not exactly sure that these two terms are interchangeable or can be used together or can be used as a difference between. So at this point in time, I can't address the difference between them because I really don't. And it's probably me not understanding what is meant by a variance. Like I said, I come from a food micro background, so all of my background is in the food industry and working in a food laboratory. So we don't have the variances we have, or maybe we're going to use buffered peptone water instead of TSB. And that requires, with a standard that requires a verification. Can we use this new media in place of this other media? We have to verify that it works. A nonconformance, well, I guess in that instance, and then the nonconformance is we did something wrong. We didn't do that. We didn't do that verification study. We said, oh, hey, we don't have BPW. We're just going to use TSB instead, and that'll be fine. Well, that goes against the SOP that says you have to use BPW. So that would be a non-conforming work. So maybe that answers the question, Anne.
Yeah, and Anne, if there's some more details that you want to type in, we can definitely revisit this too if you want us to kind of talk through that some more. We can also reach out after the fact and kind of go through that as well. Let's see. Should every nonconformance go to a corrective action?
It is not necessary for every nonconformance to have a corrective action issued. That's that risk analysis, right? So when you are when you're deciding whether, so you've got that nonconforming work that happened, well, then you have to take some actions, right? But those actions are based upon risk levels established by the laboratory. So, it could be something so simple as one of the lab techs crossed out something on a report, and they put the date, but they forgot to put their initials, which is a requirement of the standard. You have to put your initials. So do you need to launch a full-scale corrective action on that? If it was just a one-time thing, again, maybe the person was busy, maybe they just forgot, maybe this was something new that maybe your lab had just become accredited and not everybody knew that they were supposed to single line date and initial. So at that instance, you wouldn't necessarily need to perform a corrective action. So no, you do not have to perform a corrective action for every non-conforming work. You need to have those risk levels. You need to evaluate the significance of that non-conforming work. The only time where you absolutely have to perform a corrective action is if after your evaluation of that nonconformance, if there's an indication that that could recur. So if it's something along the lines of, going back to the incubator temperature being out because your thermometer hadn't been calibrated in 2 years. Well, maybe that's not the only thermometer that hasn't been calibrated in 2 years. So maybe you do want to do a corrective action, go through all of your thermometers, make sure everything's okay. That's the only time where it has to happen all the time.
Mm-hmm. Great. No, that's extremely helpful. And we had some comments from Mohammed as we were going through I think when we were talking about keep it simple, he was like, it's never that simple. And I love this comment, Mohammed. You said you find an issue, do a corrective action, and then add it to the SOP, like the changes, and it takes forever for approval. And I'm like, I wish we had more time to dive deeper into quality systems, because Mohammed, we actually, if you're talking about document approval, that's probably a whole nother topic on a whole nother day that we can go through about some of the nonconformances around that and how long it takes and what software can help can do to help you with those processes as well. So that's definitely something that we hear a lot. In fact, I would say from the Qualtrics standpoint, that's usually the #1 reason why people actually, reach out to us from a software standpoint, is that they're like, the documentation and the approval process is just too much to do manually. There's got to be an easier way. That's where people start really thinking about bringing in quality management systems. So I thought that your comment was definitely, a good point. Let's see. Yeah. Here was one. How do you make a determination between an improvement versus a nonconformity?
Also a really good question. So again, remember, a nonconformity is anything that happens in the lab that goes against your own SOP, your own procedure, anything that goes against an agreement between you and your customer. So with that in mind, you wouldn't necessarily have to do a nonconformance. So let's say, it's time for your, let's say you review your SOPs every 2 years. Well, and you're reading through this SOP and you're like, hey, we don't do this anymore. Do you need, these aren't the steps that we're actually taking anymore. We've changed a couple of things. Or I know I was working in a lab one time and we were doing E. coli 0157H7 conformations, and what we knew when I started there versus what we knew, 2 years later, that was very different. But it didn't require a nonconformance. It didn't require investigating that. It just required a little change to the SOP and improvement. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely feel free. Yeah, no, good points. And let us know if there's anything else you would like us to elaborate on there. I'm getting lots of chats in here about interest into the Quick Start QMS that we have with a workplace training. Feel free to email me. My email is right up here, Karen@qualtrics.com. We'll also, I'm taking note of the people that are asking questions about it. We'll have some of our representatives reach out to you as well, and we'd be happy to give you some more information about that. Pretty much it's a package where we are taking built-in quality management documentation and content, everything from some basic workflows and building them in Qualtrics, but then offering some templates, including like the quality manual template that's going to be in our system as well, being handled by document management. So it's a really great package, truly designed to help laboratories move towards accreditation for the first time. We worked with a workplace training, which is the consulting arm of A2LA. To put that together. And so we've had a lot of organizations start using it. We came out with it last year, in February of last year, and I've already seen a lot of organizations take advantage of it to really help streamline their efforts to 17025. So feel free to reach out. I'm also taking note of your name so we can reach out to you as well and get you some more of that information of what that looks like. If a user is to be introduced at the approval level, for example, as supervisor, will they receive an email notification at that stage once corrective action is initiated? If yes, how would they know when to go in and approve? And I'm assuming we're talking about Qualtrics here for a second. You know, being that this is an educational webinar, we really try not to go into too much about some of all of the details of Qualtrics. You know, if you want to really dive into some of the details, you know, let us know. We're always happy to give you a complete tour. One of the things that we don't talk about is this legend up here. So throughout all of Qualtrics, you as an organization is determining who's getting notified at when and how often by Qualtrics based on this legend. So anytime something's newly added, approaching its due date, late, or needs to be expedited. And so in the cases of corrective actions, if you want that supervisor to be notified at key steps throughout that process, you could actually either let people choose who's being notified in the workflow itself, or hard choose, like, I don't want to say hard code because there's no coding involved, but like actually as you're creating the workflow and editing the workflow, make it permanent that that person gets emailed at whatever steps is appropriate for that person to get emailed by the system. And then they'll continue to get emailed by the system until something gets done. The nice thing about these emails is they're also configurable, so you get to choose what's in the content of the email and everything, but there's also an escalation process. So in the event that somebody doesn't get something done in a timely manner, managers or quality managers can be notified by the system so they can step in if necessary. And when you think about, you know, not the top nonconformance that we keep hearing right now is equipment maintenance. Like, people are missing their maintenance schedules, right? If you think about all the equipment that you have to have on that maintenance schedule, if you miss one of those maintenance windows, that could be a nonconformance. Well, if somebody forgets or just chooses not to do that maintenance window, Qualtrics will remind their supervisor so they can step in if necessary. Great question. Is this compliant software used for ISO 45,000 and 14,000? It can be, absolutely. We have organizations that use it for a number of different compliances, all the way from ISO to, you know, CLIA, CAP, aerospace, TS 949. I'm messing that one up, but everything in terms of compliance, even state requirements that come in. And so you would be able to bring those into our system as well and build your quality system from that. All right, let's see, I've done that one and that one. We've got some good questions coming in. Okay, so question for Heather. We currently have Qualtrics implemented. I made some adjustments with nonconformance workflow to include risk assessment and corrective action triggers for workflows. Risk assessment always gets triggered with each nonconformance, but corrective action does not, depending on the reason for nonconformance. Would you recommend to keep this workflow, or would you rather see it into 3 separate workflows?
Well, I suppose it depends on, first off, are you an accredited organization or not? If you are an accredited organization, just remember that 710 does not require that you perform a risk assessment. It does require that the actions that you take on your nonconforming work are based on risk levels established by your lab, but the nonconforming work doesn't require the risk assessment. You can certainly choose to keep that in there. I have seen, you know, I'm sure there are some labs out there that decide that, hey, we want to do the risk, we want to do our root cause analysis during this non-conforming work procedure, but it's not required. It is required if you, you know, so you have your non-conforming work procedure. You put, I think, if I'm understanding Qualtrics correctly, you know, I don't work a lot with these non-conforming workflows because we're part of the accrediting body, not not a lab, and I'm sure that we have them. Things maybe we're not following our processes all the way, things like that. But your non-conforming work doesn't have to have that risk assessment, that root cause analysis in there. The risk assessment needs to be part of your non-conforming work, but not part of your corrective action. So I think if you have it, you know, the non-conforming workflow that has the risk assessment and then corrective action triggers for workflows, I think that works according to what the standard requires. When you start adding in the root cause analysis, you don't necessarily need that in the non-conforming workflow, but definitely need that in the corrective action.
Great, great. And thank you actually for, you know, kind of chiming in and telling us what you've done with Qualtrics. I think we actually get a kick over here on our side because we know that the system's configurable, but we never know exactly what customers do with it sometimes. And so being able to hear what you did and how you configured it for your specific laboratory is just really neat. So thank you for even sharing that with us. So Anne did write, she had a little bit more clarification on her question about variances versus nonconforming work. She says, do you need a corrective action for variance in practice?
And I think that goes back to the example that I gave earlier, using TSB instead of BPW, right? So if if you went through that verification, you did that verification study, you have the records that show that, hey, both of these types of media do the exact same thing, you get the exact same results, you wouldn't need to perform a corrective action. It's just it's when when maybe you ran out of buffer peptone water and all you had was the TSB. So that's what your lab tech used, because that's what they had, and you had to get these results out. You initiate that non-conforming work procedure. It did affect the results. It had a potential effect on the results because you didn't do the validation, you didn't do the verification using that different media. That does have to go into a corrective action.
Mm-hmm.
In that example, yes. Is it going to be that way for every time? Again, I can't answer that. It really just depends on, really just want to take into account, were the results affected? Were, the results of our work, we took, temperature, and that's not just sending out a result to a customer. It's not just this was positive, this was negative, this was in specification, this was out of specification. It's anything, you're taking temperatures. Well, what's the result of this temperature monitoring? What's the result of, air quality monitoring? Those kind of results too. So it really just depends what's been impacted, what your risk levels are in accordance with that nonconformance, and then how you choose to go, what triggers that corrective action.
Great. Well, that is all of our questions that we got in through the Q&A and the chat, and my team is telling me it's time to wrap up. If you have additional questions that are coming in, I see there's one, and Daniel, we'll get to your question, and one of us will reach out to you, especially because it deals with Qualtrack, so we'll be in touch. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We really appreciated your time. And again, you'll be able to access this presentation and the slides once we get it up and available. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll be in touch. Have a great day. Bye-bye.